Hey folks, welcome to week 7, where we're going to be returning to Douglas Harper's Changing Works. After a week in which we got to visit Professor Howitt's food forest. Before we jump into that, though, I wanted to spend just a little bit more time talking about the process of developing your research topic. I've had a chance to talk with several of you now about your research paper topics, and one of the things I've been doing is taking little index cards and drawing the X's and Y's and the arrows that we have demonstrated in class, and I've had a chance to basically kind of map out some research questions with a few of you, including topics like fair trade coffee, sushi, the paleo diet, soil health and soil problems like soil degradation related to agriculture, quinoa, and even shopping at Whole Foods. So you can see like a real big range of topics, and it didn't matter what people threw at me. I was able to give people some advice, and I think I had some happy, satisfied customers in terms of the feedback and advice I was able to give folks. So I hope you will take advantage of that opportunity too. I'll definitely do my best to try to help you get started in thinking about your topic, especially for folks who maybe are struggling a little bit and kind of feel like they don't know where to start. It's really a good step to kind of brainstorm with me. And in addition to that, I just want to reiterate some of the things that we had talked about in class about developing research topics. And so, for example, first, just this relationship again between X and Y, trying to think about what is having an effect on what. And in this case of food, when we're looking at all different types of topics with respect to food, in a lot of cases, there's production systems that you could say often tend to be the independent variable. So if we're talking about how coffee is grown or how food is grown or cultivated in some way, oftentimes that has some kind of effect on ecologies because of environmental impacts or maybe supply chains due to economic structures. So those are often topics where the production is having some effect on a set of other things that we might want to consider. Whereas consumption often tends to be a little bit more likely to be the dependent variable. Things shape patterns of consumption or are at least related to things like identity, gender politics, race and ethnicity, so forth. So that's one way to kind of think about the relationship between food, how we produce it, how we consume it, and some of those other factors. And again, it's probably best to talk with me about that and to get my feedback so that I can give you more specific ideas about maybe ways to think about how that stuff fits together. In addition, most of the concepts that we're working with related to food start out relatively broad, and if that's the case, then we can think about the dimensions that we might be able to break those concepts down into. We've talked about a few examples of that so far this semester, one example being community. We've talked about that in the context of Harper's book, Changing Works. Community has economic, cultural, political, geographic, probably more dimensions than that. And each of those dimensions helps us to kind of break down a relatively abstract word, community, into more specific elements that we can use to do some kind of analysis. And then in turn, each of those dimensions can be broken down further into subdimensions so that, for example, economic dimension of community could include things like jobs, could include things like transportation, especially transportation between different businesses. It could include things like social networks that help people find jobs or employment or connect business owners together in associations. So under each of those dimensions, we can further break it down, and the more specific we can make those dimensions and the relationship between them in terms of our question, the deeper we can go in terms of the analysis that we'll do in our paper. Broad topics that take you in a lot of different directions help you fill up pages, but the downside to that is that you can't really go deeper on it without feeling like you got to go on to the next thing and cover all the bases. So the more precise, the more specific you can make your question, the more opportunities you have for doing that kind of analysis that really gives you the depth of analysis that makes for a really solid paper and really oftentimes separates the kind of good papers from the excellent ones. So again, please talk with me. Happy to chat with you more about that. In addition to that, I really think that reading is super critical for you at this point to help refine your research questions. So make sure that you're actually finding articles, you're finding books, you're finding sources that will help you get some ideas about what your topic is about and what kind of resources exist to discuss it. So that's a really important step in addition to kind of thinking on your own and talking with me about research topics. So if you're having trouble with any of those, let's talk about them in more detail. I just want to give you a couple quick tips about finding literature and some of the tools that I tend to use when I'm doing literature searches these days, and kind of a couple strategies for how to find sources without running into too many roadblocks. So when I'm looking for sources, I tend to have two windows open, Google Scholar and the Colgate Library webpage. In each case, I'm kind of going back and forth between these two to find the sources and follow up leads on new sources that I find along the way to see how best I can access them and get copies of things that I want, whether it's a book or article mainly, or other things as well, like gray literature, reports, things like that that might be useful for my interest, my project. So let's just look up a book that I going to mention later in this lecture recording today. This is a book called Entitled to Power by Catherine Jellison, who's a well-known historian of agriculture and especially the politics of gender and technology in agriculture. Her work is cited by Harper in the chapters that we're reading from Changing Works this week. So if I want to get access to this book and I find this in Google Scholar, I can click on that and it's actually going to take me to a Google Books page. And some of the stuff is going to be in here, but usually for Google Books, there's a limit on what they're showing. So here's where I want to actually go to the library page and put in her book. So I'm going to put in Jellison, Entitled to Power in the search window. And I think what you're going to find is that a lot of books now are actually available electronically. I think that since the pandemic started, the library has actually been subscribing to more and more books in electronic format. And that's nice because it allows us to get full text of a lot of books, or at least a portion of the text for a lot of books, right through the library. And again, you might not be able to click on it directly from Google Scholar, so you take this next step of looking it up in the database for the library. So you can see there's a couple things here for her book, including a full text version of the book that I can click on. And when I do that, I think it's going to take me to JSTOR. And you can see I can click on various chapters for her book and download them and just get them right on my computer. Another important thing to point out is that in Google Scholar, and really in a lot of the different databases that we have access to find sources, there's a nice feature where we can actually see works that have cited a particular book or article since it was published. So you can see here for Jellison's book, she has cited by 238. That means there's 238 sources that have cited her work since then. And it'll have a list of, those couple hundred sources. So if you wanted to find work that really had looked at the influence of gender and technology in agriculture more recently in the literature, it's got these nice links that we can click here on the side that allows to say, for instance, since 2016, what sources have cited Jellison's work. And you can see there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff here. If you're interested in the topic of gender, femininity, masculinity, technology, and agriculture, there's a lot of really useful stuff that you can find about that particular topic. Sometimes you could just click right on an article and you'll be able to download it. So for example, you can see that there's another article here by Jellison that was published more recently in 2018 that's about farm machinery and masculinity in World War II. And that one is going to take us to this JSTOR site where I can click on download PDF and it just gives me the actual article, which is nice to have that come right to my computer. However, if I were to find another article, like say this one, Rural Sociology, or another that I wasn't able to click on directly and get the PDF immediately, oftentimes I might hit a paywall. That's where I want to actually go back to the library page and I want to click on this link called Journal Finder and put in the journal that I'm interested in. That one for rural sociology looked like I actually was able to get it from clicking on Google Scholar, but if I wasn't, I can go here and I can see all the listings that our library has for rural sociology, and you can see that it has 1997 to present in this particular subscription that they have, and I could click on that, find the appropriate year and the volume and the page, and get that article. So sometimes we have to kind of take a couple steps. If you're searching just in JSTOR, you'll be able to download all the stuff that you want because it has all the PDFs. Google Scholar, I think, is a little bit more comprehensive and allows you to find a wider range of things, although sometimes you run into some of those situations where you have to go to the library page, see if the book is there, see if we subscribe to the journal. If you don't find it in our library, then your next step is to actually submit a request for interlibrary loan. In that case, you're going to want to go to the Colgate Library page and click on this link here that says interlibrary loan. You'll have to log in or create an account, but this is where you're asking the library to actually find you a copy of the book or the article that you're interested in at another library. The sooner you find that and make the request, the sooner you can have them get it. So don't wait till the last minute to get these sources. If you think something looks useful and that's the only way for you to get it, make that request so you can get it and get started on your paper. Okay, so back to Harper. One of the key topics that we want to talk about this week as we get back into his book is this chapter he has on gendered worlds and the role of gender in the types of agricultural communities that he's studying in New York. And if you think back to the Diamond article that we read at the beginning of the semester, and we talked about his argument that agriculture is the biggest mistake that humanity has ever made, gender wasn't actually an important part of that. And he talked about how masculine and feminine work roles became more rigid as agricultural societies required, maybe not required per se, but set in place a set of structures that made distinct masculine and feminine roles around agricultural work, so that women in particular were more tied to the domestic sphere and child rearing as the demand for labor became greater and greater in these more settled agricultural communities. So overall, Diamond is making an argument that agriculture led to this set of consequences that made for a more rigid and patriarchal set of gender relations. We talked about that earlier in the semester, so that's kind of a bit of a review. But the broader point that he's making there and that's relevant for us is that the structure of our societies, and especially how we produce and consume food, shapes the gender division of labor. We have division of labor is a term sociologists use for, as the term would imply, how do we divide up jobs in our society and make segments of the world of work that's associated with certain types of people, certain characteristics and identities that we culturally, structurally believe are appropriate for one type of person or another. So that we have jobs, for example, that are gendered, that we associate with certain types of gender identities that are male or female. Part of what makes that structure a structure and makes it something that we kind of all more or less take for granted to some degree is a set of shared values that have rules, that have hierarchies, and that create the kinds of background assumptions that we have about what it means to live our lives and to do work of various kinds within these communities. Now, that's not to say that everyone agrees with it or feels like it's right. There may be some people who kind of have more or less alignment between those roles that are assumed to fit with certain genders and how they personally feel in terms of their gender identity. Other people, not so much. They may feel incredibly oppressed by the system of gender expectations. But those values are the ones that kind of are the mainstream, the norm that set those expectations that people then have to maybe kind of contest or push against if they don't like them or follow if they feel like they're just kind of subject to them. So there's some examples of this in Harper, and we're not going to talk about this quite as much until Thursday because I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity for the students who are assigned to lead discussion on that day really guide us through some of those examples. But you should be on the lookout for these as really kind of useful, interesting ones for us to pull out and discuss in class that day. I think an important part of that conversation is going to be this continuing discussion that we've had in Harper and really even before we started Harper about technology and how that creates a structure again within work and how it's changed farm work and other aspects of the community, family structure of farm life as technology itself has changed. And so in a lot of ways, you can imagine that the mechanization of farm work, adding things like tractors and threshers and reapers and all the different types of machinery that Harper mentions changing agricultural work and changing works in the 20th century, could have opened up a window for women to have new roles in the farm work that was required to plant and harvest crops, to milk the cows, all that stuff that Harper talks about in his book. But for the most part, the role of tending machines, operating machines, fixing machines, stuff like that, tended to be more considered to be the domain of men in these communities as they were introduced. And in fact, work with machines came to be seen as an important aspect for men to express their masculinity, meaning that if women got more and more involved with this type of work, their femininity would kind of taint that area and make it harder for them to express their masculinity in a really active way. So overall, technology, even though there were new ones being introduced, they still more or less were interpreted in the existing gender frames in these communities, so that the more kind of production-oriented farm work-oriented technologies were seen as a more masculine domain, and as new technologies were introduced into the home or the domestic sphere, like say like washing machines, things like that, those were seen as a more feminine type of technology that was more associated with women's work. And women were actually happy to get these technologies in a lot of cases. If you think about the work that it takes to wash clothes by hand, if you've ever tried this before, it's hard work. It's really brutal work to have to do that day after day, year after year. A lot of the other jobs too, like that are mentioned in Harper, like canning, other types of food preparation. It's just really tough work, physically demanding work. And so to have help from machinery is something that a lot of people who did that work would welcome. At the same time, a lot of research on gender and technologies shows that when those new technologies were involved to the domestic sphere, they oftentimes actually increased the amount of work that was expected of women, so that you had new machines for cleaning or cooking or other things that are part of the domestic sphere. It meant that women were supposed to do more of that work, and that the expectations for a clean home, a neat home, different types of expectations about dress or food actually created more work for women, and so that they didn't necessarily gain much ground, even if it meant maybe some of the physical drudgery of doing that work was alleviated to some degree. With that said, there are some interesting cases that we see in Harper as well as in the work of other historians who've looked at this time period. And I mentioned before this work by Jellison entitled To Power, and she looks especially at the case of World War I and World War II, when you have these kind of global crises due to the war and a lot of labor being lost in American farm fields as men went off to the war effort, moved into factory production in more urban areas. There's a real need for farm labor to do the work of producing the food, not only for the American domestic demand, but also for sending food around the world to support the war effort. So Jellison's book is really interesting and has lots of great pictures too of women doing things like driving tractors like this one here. And she gives some examples in the book of different advertising campaigns and organizations that were trying to get women to move into doing agricultural work in the same way as they were trying to do during World War II for Rosie the Riveter type campaigns to get women into factory production. So you can see in this particular advertisement, the woman even has that same kind of arm up Rosie the Riveter type pose, and the caption for the picture talks about that. Here's another one that actually is a photo of some women who are driving tractors through the field and are called the tractorettes. So there is a push during World War II to get women to be more involved in the machinery aspect and the increased mechanization of agricultural production during World War II. But just like for factory production, as men move back into the world of urban factory work as well as rural farm work post World War II, women are largely pushed back out of that sphere, and men reclaim and reassert this kind of masculine frame for farm technology, especially farm machineries, and women are more or less pushed back to the domestic sphere. Again, I think we really want to talk about these issues in class and think about examples that do demonstrate this patriarchal structure of farm communities that we see in Harper's work, but also places where we see people resisting or questioning those structures. There's some nice examples that Harper gives in some of the pictures and in some of the dialogues with his interview subjects. And so I want to make sure that we talk about that and think about ways that these are trends that seem to exist in terms of men, women, structures, and who gets to do what kinds of work, but also situations where those assumptions are questioned or challenged in certain ways. And especially in terms of the way that work is set up and the way that technology is involved in that work as well. Those are all things that we'll talk about. Again, especially in class on Thursday, I really want to make sure we have a lot of time to talk about those topics when students guide us with some questions. So see you soon in class.